professor of linguistics at MIT. Noam Chomsky is a world-renowned scholar and political analyst. He has written and lectured extensively on philosophy, international affairs, U.S. foreign policy, and the mass media, and was the subject of the award-winning film Manufacturing Consent. Any attempt to look behind the headlines into complex history of the region, economics or geopolitics is almost impossible, because any departure from exclusive focus on genocide makes one almost a supporter of genocide. So in order for us not to lose half of our audience, we just have no choice but to start with atrocities, ethnic cleansing, emotionally charged arguments. So let me start by asking you about this basic argument that we hear, that U.S. military intervention is necessary to stop genocide in Kosovo, just like 50 years ago we went to war to stop Hitler.
Well, first of all, we didn't go to war to stop Hitler, so let's put that aside. The U.S. went to war with Hitler when Hitler declared war on the United States. Through the late 1930s, the United States was rather supportive of Hitler and very enthusiastic about Mussolini. As for intervention to stop actions to stop ethnic cleansing and humanitarian catastrophes and so on, yeah, I think that's really important. And if anyone in the United States, or the U.S. or British governments or other European governments were interested in doing that, they could do it very easily in far more serious cases than this, current cases. So, for example, you're absolutely right that we get our orders from the state to focus attention just on this and to look at it in a particular way. But anyone with an independent mind is going to refuse those orders and try to understand what's going on. And there are easy ways to do it. So, for example, look not very far away at, say, Turkey, right next door. In Turkey, in the mid-1990s, under the Clinton administration, the military was carrying out ethnic cleansing, destruction of villages, massacres, torture, and terror on a scale way beyond anything that was claimed in Kosovo. And this is in the Kurdish areas. There were perhaps several thousand villages destroyed, roughly 2 or 3 million refugees, maybe tens of thousands of people killed, right in the mid-90s. As the atrocity, it was done with U.S. arms, overwhelmingly, about 80%. As the atrocities increased, Clinton increased the arms flow to make sure that they went on. In fact, when human rights groups like Human Rights Watch discovered that U.S. jets were being used illegally in violation of congressional restrictions to attack civilian targets, the Clinton administration found various ways around them and kept sending them. And this is to stop those, to prevent those atrocities would be quite simple. All we have to do is stop participating in them.
But then it brings us to the question, which massacres are fit for U.S. moral crusades?
Let's take a look at massacres, okay? The terms like massacre and genocide and so on are used very freely when people want to use them. So let's take a look at what the United States and NATO claim to be the case. And I'll assume that everything they say is true. So let's take U.S. NATO assertions about Kosovo. What they say is that up to February 1999, that's this year, okay, up to February 1999, up to March 1999, until the bombing started, there were about 2,000 people killed on all sides in Kosovo, most of them Albanian, probably the large majority of the 2,000. There were a couple 100,000 refugees. This was, according to the United States, largely, the violence began with attacks on police, Yugoslavian police, in Kosovo, which is a province of Yugoslavia, by the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army. Attacks from across the border, based and supported abroad. The Serbian army reacted, and police reacted very brutally to that, pretty much in the way we're familiar with in, say, Lebanon, where Israel reacts to attacks on its soldiers that way. With retaliation against civilians, that led to further retaliation by KLA against Serbian civilians, and a cycle of violence built up through early this year. Well, that's a humanitarian crisis, all right, but unfortunately one that's duplicated in many, many parts of the world. For example, it's almost identical to what the State Department describes as being the case in Colombia. Approximately the same number of people killed, another 300,000 refugees last year, according to the State Department, added to well over 1 million. The overwhelming majority of atrocities attributed to the Army and its paramilitary associates, who are funded by the United States with increasing flow of arms, and we can continue around the world. So that's what's now called genocide in the very specific case of Kosovo. Now, what happened on March 23rd, 24th? Well, the United States presented the Yugoslav government with an ultimatum, the Rambouillet Agreement. Although it wasn't reported here, as far as I can discover, the Serbian National Assembly rejected it, but made a counterproposal. The counterproposal was kind of vague. We don't know exactly what it meant. The State Department representative, James Rubin, was asked at a press conference on March 24th about this Serbian Assembly counteroffer, and he said, we saw no silver lining in it, so we decided to bomb. Okay, that's the end of the diplomacy. First of all, they very strongly condemned the withdrawal of the monitors, the international advisors.
Why did they leave in the first place?
They were told to leave by the U.S. The Serbian government strongly opposed that, and in the same resolution that you're talking about, they once again condemn it. They wanted the monitors back. And yes, they have a resolution saying what it says is roughly after autonomy is negotiated among the various ethnic communities, we will consider the question of an international presence to guarantee, the safety and so on of everyone. Well, okay, maybe it's a good offer, maybe it's not a good offer, but there's certainly room for diplomacy. The U.S. simply refused.
Wouldn't the international community be interested actually in having as much as possible international presence, these monitors?
Well, first of all, there's no international community. The term international community is a term of propaganda, U.S. propaganda. There is no involvement of the international community here. Zero. The United States would not allow it. The international community is the United Nations. The international community is not NATO. The NATO powers, with varying degrees of commitment, are following the U.S. lead on this, but they do not constitute the international community, though that term is used here to refer to the United States and its allies. I mean, India is part of the international community, China is part of it, South Africa is part of it, Latin America is part of it. They're mostly opposed.
Seems like liberal people have replaced analysis of these geopolitical economic factors with moral outrage, and I want to ask you about that because this seems to be totally new situation, and
It's not new. Liberals means, educated people, essentially, the majority of educated people. They tend to support state atrocities overwhelmingly. I mean, they supported the U.S. war in Vietnam, for example. How many faculty members did you see, or editors, and so on? In fact, Vietnam was a liberals' war. It was the attack against South Vietnam, which is what it was launched by John F. Kennedy. He's the one who sent U.S. Air Force planes to bomb South Vietnamese civilians, authorized the use of napalm, initiated crop destruction, started driving millions of people into concentration camps. It was supported by the liberal community, educated community, right through until the time when business turned against it. Corporate America turned against it on pragmatic grounds. It was becoming too costly. In fact, if you want to see what the attitude of liberals was, just have a look at yesterday's lead editorial in the New York Times, which happens to capture it quite accurately. They say that we shouldn't be hobbled by the Vietnam analogy in bombing Kosovo and maybe invading it. And their reasons are that in the case of Vietnam, the sacrifices of the United States were too high, and the gains were uncertain. Well, there were people on the German general staff who said the same thing about Hitler after Stalingrad. That's not opposition to the war. And if the issue here is humanitarian, there are very simple ways to stop much worse humanitarian crises, in fact, right in that region. And notice that the U.S. bombing, the U.S.-NATO bombing, radically escalated the atrocities, exactly as was expected. I mean, when you bomb people, they react. And the way they reacted is exactly as any rational person expected, namely where they're strong, not where you're strong, which happens to be on the ground. So up until the bombing, the level of, there were certainly atrocities, but they were at the level that you find all over the world. For example, the kind that the U.S. supports in Colombia, way below what the U.S. supports in Turkey. After the bombing, it's beginning to be comparable to other cases. So, for example, there was the Israeli press has the major journal there, Haaretz, which is kind of like the New York Times. They had an article by one of their major correspondents pointing out, in effect, that Kosovo is becoming like Palestine, Israel and Palestine in 1947-48, except with TV cameras. And in fact, that's accurate. The numbers are about the same. The numbers expelled are about the same. In fact, higher than. The numbers killed are about the same, and so on.
But then how can we really explain, and I'm kind of coming back to this because this is such a confusing thing, how can we explain this enthusiastic support for this bombing of the former opponents of other American interventions?
Because in this case, U.S. propaganda has succeeded in presenting it as a humanitarian endeavor. And a lot of people who are in favor of humanitarian endeavors are just caught up in the propaganda. But if you think it through, it's plain that that can't be the case. For one thing, the bombing sharply increased the humanitarian catastrophe, as exactly as was expected. In fact, that was, well, let me just quote the U.S. NATO commander, Wesley Clark. 2 days after the bombing started, he said, "It is entirely predictable that Serbia will respond by expelling people and killing them by more atrocities." So that's entirely predictable. Yeah, and in fact, it's what happened. So in Kosovo itself, the bombing increased the humanitarian disaster enormously. Furthermore, we know, just think, all you have to do is think about it. We know that the U.S. government does not care about humanitarian catastrophes, nor do the people who are getting excited about this. You can see that very easily. I mean, for example, by looking right next door in Turkey, where they have been massively supporting, even worse atrocities, and it takes nothing to stop that support. It's not, you don't have to bomb Ankara to stop the support. Just stop sending the jet planes, napalm, anti-personnel weapons, and so on. That's all it takes.
But this TV coverage focusing on, violence and atrocities, creating impression that everybody knows what's happening now. And even people who a couple of weeks ago couldn't find Kosovo on a map are now totally confident they know enough to demand that we do something. And we have this.
And how many pictures have you had of thousands of Kurdish villages that were destroyed in southeastern Turkey, tens of thousands of people who were killed, 2.5 million refugees, and so on? How many pictures have we seen about that?
Yeah,
well, the answer is zero, because the orders from Washington are, that's our atrocity, and therefore we don't talk about it.
So then we come to the interesting thing here about what's not on TV doesn't exist, and reality is made by TV. I remember Anthony Lake said about U.S. foreign policy a couple of years ago, just before the war in Bosnia started, that U.S. foreign policy is being driven by CNN and whatever
That's
CNN...
complete nonsense, and he knows it. CNN is being driven by U.S. foreign policy, and he knows that perfectly well. It wasn't the choice of CNN to focus attention solely on Kosovo and not look at Turkey. I mean, that was the choice of the U.S. government.
So why do they then just go for briefings to NATO officials or to Pentagon? Don't we have independent journalists who would explore on their own?
There are some, not many. I mean, for example, Jonathan Randall, very fine journalist, long-time Middle East correspondent of the Washington Post. He just wrote a few months ago, came out with a very good book on the atrocities in Turkey and the U.S. support for them. There's occasional journalists who try to, be independent. But overwhelmingly, that's very difficult. But if you want to keep your job, you better follow the line.
I see, but one thing that I really wanna ask you, that's my personal question, because following news from different places like in Europe, one of the dominant elements in the public debate in this country is moral outrage, this angry demand for justice, and from halls of Congress down to average person on the street, angry.
We have to make a distinction between the majority of the American population and the elite educated sectors that are involved in planning and management. They're completely different. So let's take a look back. And we have a ton of evidence on this. I mean, take the Vietnam War again. I mentioned the way it's analyzed by the New York Times, which is quite typical of educated sectors. The war was wrong because it became too costly for us. That's the general view. You take a look at the American population; their view has been completely different. It's been asked on polls regularly since the late 1960s. The most recent one was just a few months ago. People are asked what they think about the war in Vietnam. It's an open question. You don't expect high numbers. But roughly 70% since around late 60s, about 70% have said, I'm quoting, the war was fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. Among educated people, almost never, that's statistically insignificant. Maybe 1%. The standard view is it was a mistake. Well, that's a dramatic difference between the general population and educated sectors. And that is found on a lot of issues. As far as the population is concerned, you're quite right about moral outrage. But remember that people have no way to feel moral outrage about Turkey, which is far more important, because here we're directly contributing to it massively, to the atrocities. But people can't feel moral outrage about that because they never heard of it.
One of the things that I have noticed, that even a few of those people that we hear on media who are, outspoken against this war on Yugoslavia, they publicly oppose the bombing, but because it doesn't work.
That's right.
The unspoken
That's very
assumption.
much like Vietnam. If you look back at coverage of Indochina on the part of what are called the liberal media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and so on, their criticism was it wasn't working. But that's like, as I said, that's like the criticism of made by the German general staff after Stalingrad.
But what I hear there is that, maybe bombing is not the best method, but some other means will be more effective, but the goal is not in any question.
That's right, because that is the nature of being well educated. It is to accept the framework of power and not to question it.
How can then this non-negotiable assumption of, good goals and intentions of U.S. government be explained?
How can it be explained?
Yeah.
Just the manner I've just described. But well-educated people understand that that is the position you must assume. So, for example, again, let's just take yesterday's New York Times. They have a major article by one of their intellectuals, House intellectuals, Judith Miller, on sovereignty and human rights, who simply asserts as a fact that the United States has been an aggressive leader in the struggle for human rights. Well, anyone who even pays attention to the most elementary data knows that that's not true. Just look at Amnesty International reports. But that's what you say if you're a well-educated person. There's nothing new about this. What I'm saying is ought to be familiar. So let's take George Orwell. Everybody's heard of Orwell.
Right.
In fact, everyone has read Animal Farm, just about. But ask your listeners how many people have read the introduction to Animal Farm. Well, the answer will be, I can tell you right now, very few, if any. And there's a reason for that. It wasn't published. Why wasn't it published? Well, because here's what it said. Animal Farm was, of course, a satire about the totalitarian enemy, the Soviet Union.
Big brother.
Yeah, and so, of course, that was wonderful. Everybody had to praise that. But in the introduction, Orwell said, look, he's writing in England, he said, we shouldn't feel so self-righteous about it because England is not all that different. And his introduction was called Literary Censorship in England, Censorship. And he described how in free England, unpopular ideas are suppressed and marginalized and never heard, not by the same means they use in Russia, but he said the result comes out not very different. And then he even gave some reasons. And one of the reasons was pretty much what I've just been repeating. Mm-hmm. He said that well-educated people come to understand that there are certain things it simply wouldn't do to say or even to think. And that's part of the process of education. So yes, you end up with the result that we've been talking about. For a properly educated person, the idea that the United States might not have honorable motivations is just unthinkable. You can have that idea about every other country in past history or the present world. In fact, you do have it, but not about the holy state. That we just support with dedication of a kind that commissars would be impressed with. That's part of education.
Professor Chomsky, I would like to take few phone calls. Would you be open to taking few, including few of our listeners, so they have an opportunity here to talk to Professor Chomsky? Good afternoon, you're on the air. Please be brief.
You've amply demonstrated why we're not there. In your opinion, why are we there? And since the timing is suspect, is it more than a cover-up to keep Chinagate out of the media?
Thanks for the call.
Okay. It's a good question, a very good question, and it's a shame that it's not being discussed publicly because it's the main question. We can exclude the possibility of humanitarian concerns. That's impossible. So why are we there? Well, here I have to speculate. So far it's been fact. But my speculation is roughly this. Turbulence in the Balkans, no matter of what kind it is a threat to the interests of rich and powerful people. It poses a kind of a danger to Europe and hence to the United States, which is heavily involved in European economy and investment and so on. So that means any kind of turbulence in the Balkans becomes what is called a humanitarian crisis. That's a technical term. It means it might threaten the interests of rich and powerful people. In contrast, if people slaughter each other in Sierra Leone or southeastern Turkey or Colombia or whatever, it's not a humanitarian crisis because it doesn't threaten the interests of rich and powerful people. In fact, we're very often involved in it, escalating it. So this is a crisis. Well, what do you do when you have a crisis? Well, you try to reduce the turbulence. Now, there is a way to do that through the United Nations. That's in accord with world order and international law and our treaty obligations. But the U.S. completely refuses that. The U.S. has been strongly opposed to the international community, to international law, to the United Nations, to the World Court for at least 30 years. I mean, you can tell that just by looking at vetoes of Security Council resolutions. The U.S. is way in the lead since the 60s. Britain is second, France is a distant third, Russia's fourth. China doesn't exist.
Okay.
And the same is true of the World Court. The U.S. doesn't want to allow them to be there. Well, okay, then what do? If we can't allow the international community to get involved, you shift over to NATO. There, at least, the U.S. dominates it. So the thing shifts to NATO. Well, within NATO, there's also a disagreement. The United States and Britain are essentially warrior states. They have an overwhelming monopoly of force. So they quite naturally turn to the use of force as the obvious way to deal with anything.
But could a Cold War institution like NATO be converted to, either humanitarian or any other diplomatic purposes?
I mean, it's not a logical impossibility, but it would be something novel in history.
No. Okay, let me try to take a few more phone calls because our lines are really ringing off the hook. Good afternoon, you're on the air. Please be brief.
Yes, I keep seeing people equating this with the Holocaust, and I think the ghost of the Holocaust is making a lot of people irrational and unable to see the dissimilarities and unable to think clearly. And I wondered if you could comment on that.
Okay, thanks for your call.
Right. You're quite right. It is being compared with the Holocaust, and that is an insult, a horrendous insult to the victims of Hitler. I mean, if this is a Holocaust, then there have been thousands of Holocausts since 1945, beginning, for example, with what happened in Palestine in 1947 and 48, and other events much worse at the same time. I remember quoting the leading Israeli newspaper on that. They can see it. What was happening up until the bombing is a humanitarian crisis of a kind that exists all over the world, unfortunately, and we're often involved in them. What is going on right now after the NATO bombing is beginning to approach other cases, like, say, the Palestinians in 47 and 48. It's not even close yet to what's happening in Turkey right in the 1990s. It's nothing like what's going on in Africa. Why is the term Holocaust being used by people who we ought to call Holocaust revisionists? I mean, people who are denying the reality of the Holocaust. Why are those people now using it to refer to what's going on there? Well, as a justification for the violence of the state. That's all.
Okay, let me try to take a few more calls. Good afternoon, you're on the air. Please be brief.
Good afternoon. I was hoping to ask Dr. Chomsky, how do people effectively challenge this global corporate media disinformation complex? It's obviously got a stranglehold on information. How do we effectively challenge that and win? Thank you.
Thanks for the call.
I wish there were a simple answer to that, but the answer is by education, educating oneself and others, organization, pressures, alternative media, pressures on the existing media. Mainly it's a matter of breaking through the stranglehold of propaganda. And that's something that's very hard to do on your own. If you're sitting alone, looking at the television set, it's extremely hard not to think independently. With others, it's quite possible. That's what organizations are for. There are many ways of doing this. For example, there are internet forums, for example, ZNet forum, for example, which is full of debate and discussion, thousands of people contributing on these issues. And there you can interchange ideas and get an understanding.
Mm-hmm. I will ask you, Professor Chomsky, towards the end of the program to tell to our listeners maybe a few sites, and I have also a few websites that I will recommend. But let me try to take a few more calls. Good afternoon, you're on the air.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Yesterday on CNN, I heard a professor of international studies suggest that this is one of those places where Christianity and Islam come up against each other. I wonder if this could be part of a larger picture. What's your views on that?
It sounds like Samuel Huntington of Harvard, who's been peddling that idea for some years. I think it's complete nonsense. I mean, if you look at the interactions of Christianity and Islam, they go in every possible direction. The most fundamentalist Islamic state in the world, namely Saudi Arabia, happens to be a close U.S. ally. In the 1980s, the United States was fighting a virtual war with the Catholic Church in Central America. That's why the decade began with an archbishop being murdered and ended with 6 leading Jesuit intellectuals being murdered by military forces that we were supporting. I mean, in fact, there are lots and lots of complications around the world, but Islam versus Christianity is a very minor element.
Okay, let me try to include a few more calls here. Good afternoon, you're on the air.
Hello, Mr. Chomsky.
Yeah.
Professor. I'm thrilled to even be able to talk indirectly to you here, sir.
Yeah.
I'll make this quick. Did we win World War II as a nation, or was there some kind of German corporation or something that did? I'll take it. Thank you, sir.
Thanks for the call.
That's a very interesting and very complicated question, much too much for a simple answer. But the fact of the matter is that the war in Europe, so the war against Hitler, was overwhelmingly fought by the Russians. The overwhelming majority of Hitler's forces were on the Eastern Front. The U.S. and Britain were mostly fighting elsewhere. At the end of the war, the region was essentially partitioned, pretty much where the armies were. And the U.S. then returned to what had been its position in the 1930s, the U.S. and Britain, namely supporting the traditional structures, which were mostly pro-fascist, and suppressing the resistance, the anti-fascist resistance. I mean, that's why people like Klaus Barbie, to take a famous case, shifted directly from working for the Nazis to working for the U.S. occupying forces. Perhaps the most dramatic example was Reinhard Gehlen, a leading Nazi war criminal, who was the head of military intelligence and operations on the Eastern Front. Anybody who knows the history knows what that means. Well, he was immediately picked up by the U.S. CIA, made the head of U.S. operations in the East. The same thing happened in Japan, I should say. So, for example, Japan had a horrifying biological warfare program run by doctors who were the perfect equivalent of Mengele, trying it out on human subjects and so on. They were taken over by the United States. They were immunized so that they were protected from any war crimes trials. When the Russians tried to try some of them for war crimes, that was ridiculed here as communist show trials. They were taken to the United States, and they formed the basis of the U.S. Bacteriological and biological warfare program.
Okay.
And so who won? Well, let me quote a leading Central American Democrat, Arevalo, who was the first Democratic leader in Guatemala. He wrote a book around the mid-1950s in which he said, unfortunately, Roosevelt lost the war and Hitler won it, judging by what was going on in Central America.
So pretty much old story. Let me try to take a few more phone calls. Good afternoon, you're on the air. Please be brief.
Hi, it's a pleasure to talk to you, Dr. Chomsky. I'd like to get back to what you were talking about the rich and powerful aspect of this in terms of who's in control. If you could maybe break that down and help us understand how to follow the money here. I think it might help people clarify in their minds about what's really going on. Thank you.
Thanks for your call.
Well, there isn't much disagreement about where power lies. There are 7 rich countries, G7 they're called. Those are overwhelmingly dominated internally, just as including the United States, by corporate and financial sector. So there's a highly concentrated corporate sector by now, a lot of it multinational, international financial sectors, small groupings of them with tight connections internationally, and they form the sort of corporate, the corporate banking, financial, private power sector, which is closely integrated with governments. The rich governments relies on them and largely dominates them. And then they have their international institutions, like the IMF, for example.
Right, and that was
a lot of their
actually
work for them. And that's it's not like the Communist Party with a leadership, but it's a pretty closely interconnected array of highly concentrated power centers.
Let me try to include.
Which
I know that
the media. They're just part of the corporate sector.
I know that so many people would like to at least briefly be with you, Professor Chomsky. So I'll try to include a few more listeners. Good afternoon. You're on the air.
Thank you. I would just like to address the question about how to fight, not fight, but address propaganda and its effect on our brains. And from my experience, I think the school system causes a separation between right brain and left brain thinking. And a way to fight that propaganda is to do integrative thinking with analytical and creative combinations. And I was wondering if you could address that.
Thank you for the call.
Yeah, you could be right. I mean, I think a lot of the problems begin very early in the school system. I mean, my own guess is that they come from other sources, but not much is understood about these things, and I think what you suggest could well be worth pursuing.
Okay, let me try to include some more listeners.
Professor Chomsky, I admit when I'm attempting to analyze U.S. actions, I'm always inclined to follow the money. And I know an economic analysis by itself may oversimplify the situation, but could you speak about what economic or natural resource issues might be in play and what role it might have in developing U.S. or NATO strategy in the region?
Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I think actual resource interests, for example, or direct economic interests in the Balkans are pretty slight. On the other hand, the Balkans is a highly strategic area. It's and always has been. For example, it's right on the periphery of the Middle East, which is the main energy source for the world. The United States is dedicated to controlling the Middle East. In fact, its support for Turkey and Israel is part of its general strategic conception for controlling the Middle East, and the Balkans are part of that. In fact, Greece, which is part of the Balkans, was actually in the Near East section of the State Department, not in the European section until the mid-'70s. Also, the Balkans are an opening towards Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and they're very critically located with regard to Western Europe. So things that happen there matter for the interests of the dominant state and corporate sector in Europe and the United States. They matter a lot.
All right.
But it's not the Balkans has zinc or something.
Good afternoon. You're on the air.
Hi. I know there's no simple solution to this, but I think in the back of everyone's mind, even in the midst of trying to figure out all the ins and outs of why and how, but in your opinion, where might hope lie? What direction for the resolution?
Thanks for the call.
In Kosovo?
Yeah, Kosovo.
Yeah. Well, Kosovo is harder than other cases. Like in Turkey, it's easy. Then just stop contributing to the massacres. In Kosovo, it's harder. In my view, the bombing has been a catastrophe. It's made things far worse in Kosovo, predictably. It has almost wiped out a very promising and courageous democratic movement in Belgrade and the rest of Yugoslavia, which was the best hope of getting rid of Milosevic. You want a dramatic example of that? Have a look at this morning's New York Times, where the front page story describes new NATO strategy, and one of the things they talk attacking the economy in order to harm Milosevic. Well, one of the main example they give is the attack on a car automobile manufacturing plant, and that's going to really hurt Milosevic. What they don't point out, but they surely know, is that the workers in that plant had formed a very dissident union, which had carried out major strikes against Milosevic. That's what NATO is destroying. And we can go on. From every point of view, I think it's a disaster. So the first thing to do is stop it. When you're carrying out something that's a disaster, first thing to do is stop it.
Another thing.
Then what's the next thing to do? Well, the next thing to do is to pursue what remain of the diplomatic negotiating options that were there on March 23rd, see to what extent they can be pursued. Now, I don't think the United States and NATO ought to be very much involved in this. They've discredited themselves. But there are a lot of other people in the world. I mean, get Nelson Mandela to come in, get India to come in.
But doesn't every new day of bombing kind of narrows down the possible options?
Absolutely. As soon as you start using violence, you narrow the options. And the more you use violence, the more you'll narrow them.
Just one more phone call for today. Good afternoon, you're on the air.
Yes, I wanted to ask Professor Chomsky that it seems like the media is manufacturing consent for agreement for a ground war, and does he foresee a ground war in Kosovo now?
Thanks for the call.
You want to know my nightmare scenario, which I wake up having bad dreams about? The nightmare scenario is that, yes, there'll be a ground war, and the United States will send in the Wehrmacht, the German army, to finish up what they started to do in the early 40s. Except this time, instead of getting bombs from the West, they'll be getting applause from the West. That's the nightmare scenario. I hope it doesn't happen.
What is the situation with Russia? I mean, we didn't mention it today, and I know there is so many things we cannot cover. But weren't we always very mad when Russia was meddling in Central America and Cuba? This is our backyard, and now if Yugoslavia is considered Russia's backyard, are the Russians going to be mad about this? Can they even do?
They're furious. I mean, and in fact, you want an even worse nightmare scenario than the one that I mentioned, and not impossible, is that some high Russian military officers, maybe generals or whatever, will be so furious that they'll simply start a nuclear war.
One of the things that I wanted to mention, we have just a few more minutes here on the program, and I'm getting a lot of, when I have open lines and listener call in, there is this angry response. The devastation of Yugoslavia is okay because it will teach Serbs a lesson, and also bombing Milosevic is a warning to other dictators. Is there any merit to that kind of thinking?
No, because we support dictators who are much worse than he is. I mean, we support murderous dictators who are far worse than Milosevic. How's this going to be a warning to them? I mean, at least if they have a brain functioning, they'll look at the way we act, and they'll discover that the U.S. has been and continues to be quite willing to support dictators as long as they follow orders. I mean, let's just take Milosevic. I mean, at 1995 at Dayton, the Dayton Agreement was an agreement with Milosevic, which sold out the Kosovo Albanians. That's one of the reasons that their very powerful and impressive nonviolent movement in Kosovo turned to violence. They recognize that, at least if they have a brain functioning, they'll look at the way we act, and they'll discover that the U.S. has been and continues to be quite willing to support dictators as long as they follow orders. I mean, let's just take Milosevic. I mean, at 1995 at Dayton, the Dayton Agreement was an agreement with Milosevic, which sold out the Kosovo Albanians. That's one of the reasons that their very powerful and impressive nonviolent movement in Kosovo turned to violence. They recognize that the United States understands nothing but violence. We preferred Milosevic to Rugova, and the Albanian movement gave them nothing.
How about KLA, which we are now, actually, that's the only Albanian movement that we do support.
Well, that's not so clear. Up until very recently, the last few days, in fact, the U.S. was condemning the KLA as a very dangerous force, something like the Taliban, made up of Islamic fundamentalists, Albanian Stalinists, drug runners, and so on. There were major stories about that from U.S. government sources in the New York Times, for example.
But I'm referring to the William Cohen, Minister of Defense, who said, yes, he promised...
Yes, today. That was not a week ago. Remember that they keep changing their story. But their picture of the picture they were giving the press on the country of the KLA up until a very few days ago is that it's extremely dangerous Stalinist, Islamic, narco-trafficking type organization.
So how can they overnight then become good guys?
They can't become anything. I mean, maybe that was false then, and maybe it's false now, but both stories can't be true. What's changed is that Cohen is finally beginning to recognize that the U.S., by just bombing, the U.S. is unlikely to achieve any of its goals and is making the situation much worse.
What are the goals? Because we can also have heard set of difference. We started with the goals forcing Milosevic to sign Rambouillet Peace Accord. Then it was...
the goal is to to ensure that NATO, meaning the United States, dominates the region, and a specific proposal was made which would involve NATO ground forces inside Yugoslavia. And that's probably their goal. They know they're not going to achieve that goal now by bombing, and they therefore are turning towards the question of ground forces, and the obvious thing is, okay, let's arm this group that we called a terrorist army just recently. After all, the United States has often done that. I mean, it did it in Nicaragua. It armed a murderous, brutal terrorist army and sent it in to attack civilian targets in Nicaragua.
But then
that's why the U.S. was condemned by the World Court.
But if we really do intensify these air attacks against Yugoslavia and really destroy Milosevic army, which supposedly it's going to happen any day, now then if KLA overtakes Kosovo, is that a better future?
That's not very likely. I mean, first of all, they don't seem to be harming the Yugoslav army. American correspondents on the ground who've been traveling around, like Michael Dobbs of the Washington Post, say there doesn't seem to be much effect on the Serbian army, which is not too surprising if it's true. After all, remember that for 40 years, in fact, almost 50 years, the Yugoslav military has been preparing for a ground attack. Namely, they expected a ground attack from the Soviet Union, and that's what they're set up for. This kind of attack is not probably having not too much effect on them, just as U.S. journalists are reporting right now. On the other hand, if the bombing goes on, and really becomes something like Indochina, like you just turn the place into a moonscape, then maybe an army, an Albanian-based army, supported by NATO forces, might be able to do something. I mean, I think it'll leave a complete disaster, but maybe something.
But even Kosovo, independent Kosovo, is it even an option? Because Yugoslavia was a small country, 22 million people altogether. We have 5 different states today as we speak, and Kosovo is the 6th one in the making. I mean, can it even exist as an independent country at all?
Well, at this point, I don't think it can. I mean, 5 years ago, I would have said, yes, it can. So 5 years ago, I think it was imaginable, say at the time of Dayton, 1995. It was imaginable that steps could have been taken towards turning Kosovo into a republic rather than a province. And once it was a republic, it technically has the right to secede. And it's conceivable that something might have happened like Slovenia. I don't think it's likely.
But we have seen that in all secessionist republics, as soon as they declare independence, they become ethnically pure, cleansed. Croatia is the first example.
That's right. And what would have happened in Slovenia?
Wouldn't Kosovo then become cleansed of everybody who is not Albanian?
Well, everybody is an exaggeration, but almost everybody. Yeah. In fact, this has been going on for years. The Albanian population has been increasing, the Serbian population declining, partly and for one reason, because a lot of Serbians are fleeing.
But then would it be more okay if Albanians do ethnical cleansing? Are we not opposed to cleansing in general, or just Serb
cleansing?
Who is opposed?
The United
U.S.
States.
government,
Since when? Is opposed to ethnic cleansing in eastern Turkey? Of course it's not opposed to ethnic cleansing.
But I mean, Balkan policy, we always hear this thing about
That's
ethnic
what you
cleansing.
hear. But was the U.S. opposed when Croatia drove out a couple 100,000 Serbs from Krajina? No, it's done with U.S. arms and U.S. support.
Okay, looks like bleak prospects for Kosovo.
I mean, the first thing to do is not believe propaganda, whether it comes from Milosevic or Clinton or Russia or anywhere else.
Oh, on that note, let me make the last question for you, Professor Chomsky. And I've been referring our listeners to Z Magazine website, www.zmag.org. Is there anything in particular that you want to mention at this point? Because a lot of times listeners say, well, okay, I don't want to watch CNN, but what else can I do?
Yeah, that's one source. There's plenty of others. There are a lot of independent journals. I'm sure there are a lot of websites, of forums around. I don't happen to follow the internet much, so I can't say. Mm-hmm. But I know they're going on, and this one is huge. I mean, I spend don't know, 7 or 8 hours a week just answering questions on it.
Oh, so you can be reached via email
Yeah, I
on
can
that
be
forum.
reached that way.
So is that the same one, www.zmag.org? Okay. Well, Professor Chomsky, thank you so very much for being with us.
Okay.
It was a pleasure having you.
Glad to be with you.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. Well, that was our Global Kitchen for today with our guest, Professor Noam Chomsky of MIT. And to repeat the website, then you can reach Noam Chomsky and also have an excellent selection of articles on Kosovo by Noam Chomsky and other authors. It's www.zmag, that's zmag.org. Also International Action Center, www.iacenter.org. And Swedish organization dedicated to conflict resolution, it's www.transnational.org. Excellent places to start informing yourself, like Professor Chomsky has said.